Thank you so much, Pablo.
So Batman.
You see a depth of knowledge and a lot of those resource and experience. I know you may have some questions and probably quite a few questions. We're going to invite you to write them down, make a note of them. We're going to have a presentation following. We're going to have Adrian presenting on the local environment, and after which we're going to open it up to the panel for them to field questions, so you can direct your questions to any person on the panel. So we're going to ask you to be patient a bit with your questions, because I know you have quite a few questions. And so Pablo highlighted quite a bit of information on the global scene, saying that the US is really less than 19% of the world economy, and China is over 16% now, but in a few years will be the leading in terms of the world economy. And it speaks to imperatives for us in terms of Jamaica-China relations. He spoke of Mexico in our backyard because of proximity and the types of opportunities that are there in Mexico. He spoke of the repositioning and the need to expand opportunities and to explore what is there. He says the US economy, the indicators of the US economy, economic indicators are quite favorable, quite positive. I think sometimes we look at the headline issues of growth numbers maybe downgraded or revised downward, and we think it's all doom and gloom. But he's gone into depth and showing where they are positive, where there are opportunities that are there. Spoke of the global risk rebalancing, speaking of countries experiencing rebalancing, and which countries are now exhibiting tremendous improvements in credit quality, and those that have deteriorated. Saying Mexico again, showing as a positive destination. And speaking, we've heard some of those discussions and encouragements coming that we have to further diversify in terms of our trading relations, to diversify in terms of our bilateral relations. He spoke of the external, the net takeaway, if you will, is that external conditions are quite favorable. And then we don't have time to waste. We have to move. We have to, in our own experience locally, as Jamaica interfaces with the global environment, we are in a good place. And it doesn't mean that we don't have our challenges and aren't emerging out of crisis, but in a good place, because if we are committed and remain focused and continue to rehearse and articulate that end game and move towards that, then we can see a tremendous difference in terms of game changer for the Jamaican economy and experience. So put our hands together again for Pablo Boyard for such a tremendous exposition. We want to at this time welcome our presentation from Dr. Adrian Stokes. He's going to examine, in tandem with Pablo's examining the global economic environment and opportunities and some concerns that may exist on a global scene. Adrian is going to focus on the local environment and speak of some of the opportunities that exist locally and give his own perspective. Adrian is currently the group strategist for Scotiabank, the Scotiabank Group. He is responsible for leading and managing the strategic planning process for the Scotia Group and its subsidiaries. It's from UWI. I don't see it here, but I could say I taught him for some time. I'm gonna have to charge him for that. But before being recruited by Scotiabank, he had tremendous experience elsewhere in the Jamaican financial sector. I've heard people describe him as the leading economist. And I like to say, to be politically correct, we say one of the leading, but those of us who know him well say, well, we can't say the leading, because he's well known and well rehearsed in terms of the Jamaican experience. Let's put our hands together and welcome Dr. Adrian Stokes, examining the local economic environment.
Thank you, Wayne. Deputy Governor General, Honorable Stedman Fuller, President and CEO of Scotiabank, Mr. Bruce Bowen, other executives of Scotiabank Group, Mr. Wayne Powell, Mrs. Rosemary Pilliner, Scotiabank colleagues, special invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Also to recognize Mr. Don Webby, the chairman of a committee that I sit on at the PSOJ, and also Christopher from Capri Tufton. So today my presentation will focus on the Jamaican economy, as Wayne said. Particularly, I will look at the main elements of the IMF agreement and give an assessment of the likelihood of Jamaica successfully completing the program. And I will close by looking at some of the opportunities that are on the horizon. So, Jamaica has entered into an extended fund facility with the IMF that will last for 4 years. And to be certain, countries tend to opt for extended fund facilities when they face chronic balance of payment problems, as opposed to the standby agreement that Jamaica had the last time around. The program seeks to restore fiscal sustainability, sustainability to GOJ finances, and importantly, to materially lower the debt burden to 96% of GDP by 2020. A key part of the program is to make the Jamaican economy more competitive, and that will be achieved via a raft of far-reaching structural reform measures. So let's get into it. Now, a key quantitative benchmark for the country is the primary surplus target, and this target is set at 7.5% over the life of the program. And for the benefit of everyone here, the primary surplus refers to all the revenues that come into the consolidated fund, less non-interest expenditure, for example, wages and salaries. So in essence, the program requires Jamaica to be frugal, right? To contain expenditure to achieve this important 7.5% primary surplus target. Historically, we have had larger primary surplus numbers, so it's not unprecedented, this 7.5%. However, in recent years, what we have seen is a constant dwindling of the primary surplus, and that's because of pressures especially on the revenue side. Revenues haven't been growing as fast as they have done historically, and therefore what we're seeing is that it has become more difficult to generate primary surpluses. So essentially what you're looking at is my projection, right, for the primary surplus going forward. And I've compared that to the 7.5% primary surplus target. So the takeaway from that slide is that while we are close to the 7.5% target, we are not there. This slide looks at a similar picture, but looking at the fiscal deficit. And again, the fiscal deficit is the primary surplus less the interest expense on the debt. So if you take the primary surplus, you extract the interest expense, you get what we call the overall fiscal balance. Now, this is not a major objective for the IMF. The IMF tends to focus more on the primary surplus, but nonetheless, the fiscal balance is important for Jamaica because it's also part of the fiscal responsibility framework, which is actually law in Jamaica, which calls for a balanced budget by 2015-2016. So essentially what I've done there is to project what the fiscal deficit will be over the life of the IMF program, and to see how that will compare to what's in the fiscal responsibility framework. So it's not showing properly there, but essentially I am seeing a larger deficit of around 1.5% of GDP as opposed to the 0% by 2015-2016. And what I'm picking up in Jamaica's numbers so far is that there is a 1% of GDP shortfall in the medium term. In other words, we require an additional, let's say, JLL of $15 billion for the program to be fully funded. The next thing I want to look at is the debt trajectory, right? Now, what I've done here is to include all of Jamaica's debt. That is, and a significant part of the debt is the Petrocaribe debt. And this is a little bit confusing for some persons because the number that you will hear of often is the debt to GDP of around 130, 140%, and then in some places you will hear 150%. What's going on there is that the number depends on whether or not you include the Petrocaribe debt. If you include the Petrocaribe debt, then the number comes out around 150%. So if you look at what's happening there, right, then again, a key target in the fiscal responsibility framework is for the debt to fall to 100% by 2015-2016. And I guess what I'm saying here is that that will not be achieved, right? Even if you exclude the Petrocaribbean debt, there's no way we're going to get to 100% debt to GDP by 2020. Importantly though, if you look longer term, if you go out to 2020, the debt to GDP actually approaches the target that the IMF has of 96% of GDP. Right now we have it at 98%. And that difference is showing up because of the primary surplus being missed by about 1% of GDP over the life of the program, which is why I said that the program, from my perspective, requires an additional $15 billion to be fully funded. Now, why do we say that the IMF program will be difficult and shrouded with risk? So you have heard the IMF in their press release said that the program will be difficult. And in other places, other fora, I've also said that the program will be risky. And let me tell you why we're saying that. Now, the answer really lies in the lack of growth in the Jamaican economy. So if you look at the graph, around 2008, the financial crisis, the Jamaican economy was knocked off its historical long-term growth rate, right? So that line that you see going there, that's all historical, and if you project outward, that's where the economy would be. Now, so there has been a significant, what we call structural change in the growth path. So that's a dotted line that you're looking at there. So what is happening is that the economy has moved to a lower growth path, and it hasn't recovered since. Now, this is a massive problem, ladies and gentlemen. It's a massive problem because the growth path before wasn't significant, and now you're moved to a lower growth path. That's one of the reasons why we say that the program will be risky. Let me give you another reason why, or explain the problem from a different perspective. If you notice, if you look around 2007, again, you'll realize that the economy took a dip, obviously because of the financial crisis. Now, what has happened is that it will take up to 2016 for us to reach the same level of output that we were producing in 2007. In other words, we would have taken 9 years to recover. Now, so, if you will, it's our lost decade, right? 9 is not exactly 10, but say economists are failed mathematicians, but it's tantamount to Jamaica's lost decade, that for a 9-year period, the economy would have been below the level it was producing at before the crisis. Again, a major problem for the program. So the takeaway so far is that there's a growth problem, right? You knew before, but I'm illustrating that problem here. There's a massive growth problem that is creating all this risk in the program. So I have outlined the main objectives of the IMF agreement, and I've established the growth conditions that will prevail over the life of the program. What I want to do now is to move to examine the direction of the main macroeconomic variables. The first thing I want to do is to look at the stance of monetary policy, specifically where we expect short-term interest rates to go. Now, right now, real interest rates are negative. And this is a good thing, right? It's a good thing for the government, it's a good thing for the economy. If the government has a lot of debt, then it's a good thing to have negative real interest rates. It's not so good for savers, but in a depressed economy, you don't want people to be saving in any event. You want people to be consuming and people to be borrowing and investing. So we expect the BOJ to keep its main policy rate at 5.75% with a bias towards reducing that 30-day rate. And we expect them to do that if the fiscal consolidation program is successful. Now, long-term rates are approximately equal to expected short-term rates, which means long-term rates will rise if the market expects short-term rates to rise. Now, since the economy is weak, right, then in all likelihood, short-term rates, we do not expect the central bank to be raising rates, and in all likelihood, we do not expect market rates other market-determined rates to be going up. So the moral of that story is that we expect longer-term rates also to be well anchored. Now, there are two upside risks to what I've just said. The first one is that if the fiscal consolidation program is not successful, then that creates solvency concerns for the government and for the market, and that will place upward pressure on rates. The second caveat to what I've said in terms of rates being bounded, at least in the medium term, is that market illiquidity could cause a problem. Now, the JDX has created an interesting problem for the market. It has pushed out maturities, and therefore, if you look at what was going on in the market, people were planning their liquidity management based on certain amortization of assets that they have on their books. Those assets have gone away, or they have gone away to longer term maturities. So that will create, or can create, a liquidity problem in the market, and if the central bank is not careful, then it could have a problem to deal with. Well, let me just mention inflation. Inflation, we expect to be well contained, largely because of the weak demand conditions. That is not to say you will not have periodic spikes, but for the most part, we expect inflation to be contained. In terms of the exchange rate, year to date, the currency has depreciated by 6.54%. Importantly, the pace of monthly depreciation has slowed materially from 3.15% in January of this year. In fact, the currency has seen some revaluation in recent weeks, approximately 0.29%, on the back of the IMF agreement. So the question that arises is, where do we expect the currency to go from here? To do that, to give a sense of direction, what I've done here is to look at the real exchange rate. And for the benefit of everyone here, the real exchange rate is just the nominal exchange rate. And the nominal exchange rate is the rate that you hear about, the 99 to 1, the 98 to 1, and so on. That's what we call the nominal exchange rate. And if you adjust that exchange rate for relative price differential, you get what we call the real exchange rate, at least the exchange rate on what we call a purchasing power parity basis. When the index is above 1, we say that the currency is overvalued, and it's below 1, we say that it is undervalued. And if it's 1, it's fair valued. So in essence, what you're looking at there is that certainly from 2009, the currency has been fairly overvalued. But that level of appreciation has been retarded by the nominal depreciation that we have seen in recent months and weeks. Now, what does this mean? This means that there is less pressure for the currency to fall sharply going forward. So the punchline of what I've just said is, expect the currency to depreciate going forward, but not at the same pace that we have seen in recent months. The next thing I want to do is to look at our credit rating outlook. And what I can say is that if the government hits the 7.5% primary surplus target, then we expect an improvement in the credit rating to B minus next year. And for that rating to be further improved to B, as the people become convinced that the program is sustainable. The final thing I want to do, see Wayne telling me I have 2 minutes here? Trust me, I'll finish on time. The final thing I want to do is to look at the opportunities emanating from the program. And indeed, the opportunities are to be found in the reform measures. And what I've done, I've listed a number of them there, but in the interest of time, I will focus on a couple of them. The first one that I think is really important is the secured transactions legislation. Now, this legislation will pool or increase the pool of eligible securities and thereby make it easier for some borrowers to access credit. The legislation, therefore, has the potential to increase credit in the economy and the attendant benefits which come with expanded credit. The other thing I want to mention is m-commerce. Now, by m-commerce, I mean the use of mobile phones to conduct business or in commerce. Now, the Bank of Jamaica recently released the guidelines that will govern e-commerce, m-commerce rather, and I expect to see a lot of innovation in the space, and this will be significant, especially for the near-bank segment of the population. Okay. Now, what do you need to know? The fiscal consolidation and debt program the government agreed with IMF will be difficult to achieve. This difficulty stems from the fact that growth over the life of the program never exceeds 2%, never surpasses 2%. And as I've shown you before on the slides that showed the excess capacity, that creates a major problem. Now, there are things the government of Jamaica can do to avoid the road to perdition. This involves, or I should say, Wayne will tell you that this does not involve solely cutting expenditure. In other words, you can't cut your way to salvation. So what the government has to do? Ultimately, the government has to implement the reform measures in the program, the tax reform measures, the public sector reform measures, and generally measures to improve the competitiveness of the Jamaican economy. Because unless we increase the projected growth rate to what is built into the program, then the risk of failure is fairly high. But importantly, there is a path to achieve the 96% debt to GDP ratio by 2020. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.